This hearing of the committee will come to order at this time. Since September 11th of 2012, the committee has been focused on the tragedy in Benghazi, Libya, where terrorists killed 4 Americans that day, including our ambassador, the first ambassador, U.S. ambassador, killed in the line of duty since 1979. The focus of today's hearing, which is our 4th, is the troubling lack of accountability we have seen within the State Department since that time. The bottom line is that over 1 year later, no State Department personnel have been held accountable for the Department's failure to protect the Benghazi consulate and the U.S. personnel there. Not one. As we know, there were so many things wrong with the State Department's decision-making before the fatal attack. In the face of a glaring need, with violence in Benghazi mounting, critical security requests from the field were denied at State. The Department was asleep on 9/11, and this led to the Accountability Review Board to find, in their words, systemic failures and leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 State Department bureaus. But no State Department personnel have been fired or even disciplined. No one has missed a paycheck. Accountability can be painful. Those making bad decisions may have long and otherwise good records, but the Department cannot have a culture of accountability, which is what any well-functioning organization needs, and which is essential to protecting its personnel, if no one, literally no one, is held accountable for the mismanagement and poor leadership the ARB itself identified. Now let's look at how the Department's review process has played out. The ARB failed to interview the Secretary of State and improbably capped responsibility at the Assistant Secretary level. 4 officials are then placed on administrative leave in a process that appears to have violated State Department personnel policies. The former Secretary ceded her authority to take action against the 4 individuals or others to a new Secretary for his review. And finally, 4 officials on paid leave were reinstated and reassigned into unspecified positions at this review's conclusion, while at least 1 individual connected with failed management policies has received a promotion. I wish I did, but I just don't see the level of accountability that Benghazi warrants, indeed, that Benghazi demands. And meanwhile, not one terrorist perpetrator has been captured. Not one terrorist perpetrator has been killed, despite the President saying that that was a highest priority. The terrorist threat in much of the world, unfortunately, is only increasing. U.S. facilities obviously are tempting targets. The State Department, with this committee's encouragement, has undertaken some important embassy security reforms. We have put many of those reforms into legislation passed out of the committee, which also authorized the administration's full funding request for embassy security. But no amount of money will ever overcome poor management, and poor management is a given without accountability. I would ask all committee members, are you comfortable with this process that has no State Department official being held accountable in any meaningful way? Other committees have been working on other aspects of Benghazi. Many questions have been answered. This committee will continue to focus on accountability, including legislation to reform the Accountability Review Board process so that it is truly independent, and future Secretaries of State of either party cannot stack the deck. I would hope to have bipartisan support for that. As we hold this hearing, we should focus on the facts, we should ask the difficult questions, but work in a way that is going to lead to the most productive outcome, and that is learning from mistakes, and improving the security of U.S. diplomatic personnel serving overseas, many, by the way, in increasingly threatening surroundings. That is a committee goal I know we can all agree upon, and I will now turn to Ranking Member Engel for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and as I've said many times before, I'd like to commend you for the bipartisan way that you've presided over the committee this year and that we've worked together in a very bipartisan way. Unlike some other committees, our members have consistently conducted themselves with dignity and decorum, and I hope we can really continue that today, despite the strong feelings that many of us have, different opinions on both sides of the aisle. All of us agree that the deaths of 4 brave Americans in Benghazi on September 11th, 2012 were a terrible tragedy. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks, Secretary Clinton convened an Accountability Review Board, or ARB, to determine what went wrong and to make recommendations to improve security at our diplomatic posts. Among those chosen to serve on the ARB were Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Admiral Mike Mullen, 2 men with impeccable reputations and unparalleled experience. In its report submitted last December, the board found that there were, quote, systematic failures and leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 bureaus at the State Department, unquote, that led to inadequate security in Benghazi. Secretary Clinton took personal responsibility for the attacks and accepted all of the recommendations of the ARB. The State Department, now under the leadership of Secretary Kerry, has implemented or is in the process of implementing all of the recommendations. To support the work of the ARB and the efforts of the State Department, I introduced the Embassy Security and Enhancement Act of 2013. This non-controversial legislation, much of which was incorporated into the State Department authorization bill that the committee recently passed, would help improve diplomatic security planning, strengthen physical security, and enhance security training. Mr. Chairman, our committee has a responsibility to ensure that our brave diplomats and aid workers have the security they deserve. At the same time, we must recognize, as Ambassador Chris Stevens surely did, that there is a certain amount of risk inherent in these occupations, and that effective diplomacy cannot be conducted from behind the walls of a fortress. Now, I've heard a lot of things said about personal blame of President Obama, but let me say this. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are no more responsible for what happened in Benghazi than George Bush was for what happened on 9/11, or what Ronald Reagan was for what happened to the murder of over 200 of our military personnel in Beirut. The Congress cut funding for embassy security. There are lots of fingers to be pointed all the way around. But I think we shouldn't point fingers. We should try to get to the bottom of it, and hopefully in a non-political way. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witness, Under Secretary of State Pat Kennedy, for whom I have tremendous respect, on how we should best manage and mitigate risk at our diplomatic posts around the world. I would also like to hear from him about the progress made in implementing the recommendations of the ARB and about the Department's decision regarding the employment status of the 4 State Department officials identified in the ARB. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I'd like to reiterate my hope that we can manage a high level of civility in our discussions today and that we don't engage in gotcha politics like some other committees do. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. This morning, we are pleased to be joined by the Undersecretary of State for Management, Patrick Kennedy. As Undersecretary for Management, he is responsible for the people, resources, facilities, technology, financial operations, consular affairs, and security for Department of State operations, and is the Secretary's principal advisor on management issues. Ambassador Kennedy, welcome. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. The members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record. And I would like to remind everyone, including our witness, that today's hearing is part of this committee's continuing investigation and review on these matters. Thus, any willful misrepresentation or false statement by a witness is a criminal offense under 18 U.S. Code Section 1001. Indeed, that is the case at all of our hearings. So I look forward to a full and frank exchange during our proceedings today. And Ambassador Kennedy, Would you please summarize your remarks at this time?
Thank you very much. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the tragic events of September 11, 2012 in Benghazi, Libya. The Department maintains a robust global presence at 285 locations, many in challenging security environments where U.S. national security interests are at stake. Every day we work to protect our people and missions by constantly assessing threats and our security posture. In all the discussions on overseas security over the past year, one strong point of agreement is that America needs to have a robust presence abroad to advance our national security interest, even in dangerous places. The Department fights terrorism, enhances the rule of law, fights disease, and promotes fair trade. These myriad activities are often accomplished by the whole of the United States government. Over 30 different United States government agencies have a presence overseas in the facility that the State Department manages and secures. Almost as long as the United States has sent its diplomats out into the world, there have been those who abhor the freedoms that America represents and those who seek to do us harm. The attacks in Benghazi in September were a tragedy for the family and loved ones of these four patriots, for the Department of State, and for our nation. As the President has made clear, the United States is committed to bringing the perpetrators to justice. We are also committed to taking necessary steps to prevent such tragedies in the future. While we can never eliminate all risk, our constant goal is to mitigate risks to the maximum extent possible. As described in my written statement, the Department mitigates risk in large part through two major security programs: physical security upgrades and construction of new facilities by the Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations, and technical, physical, and procedural security programs implemented by the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. Following the September attacks, President Obama and Secretary Clinton immediately called on the State Department to review and improve security. State, with the assistance of the Department of Defense, deployed interagency security assessment teams to 19 high-threat posts to identify security improvements that could be enhanced and implemented both in the near and longer term. Per statute, an independent accountability review board was convened. On December 19, 2012, the ARB presented its findings and 29 recommendations to the Secretary of State. State has already addressed almost all of these recommendations and is working diligently with Defense and others to implement those that remain, those that require more time and resources, such as deploying the full contingent of Marine security guards. Of note, the Department has already created a Deputy Assistant Secretary for High-Threat Post who is responsible for focusing attention on those particular locations, ensured all high-threat posts have adequate life safety equipment, designed an intensive 10-week Arabic alert language course specifically for personnel in the security field that will begin next month. We are reinforcing throughout the Department's workforce the predicate that security is everyone's responsibility. Over the past year, we have been working with Defense to establish 35 additional Marine Security Guard detachments, to increase the size of existing Marine Security Guard detachments, and to establish a rapid augmentation force in Quantico to add additional Marines to posts as the situation warrants. Following the ISET efforts in the autumn of 2012 and the ARB report, the Department requested authority to transfer $1.4 billion from one account to another for an increased security proposal. And in the 2013 Continuing Appropriations Act, Congress funded this request, for which we are deeply grateful. These funds are being used to provide facilities for the additional Marine Guard detachments, as well as for embassy construction and security renovations. We have also began the recruitment of 151 additional diplomatic security personnel, and 113 have already been hired. We have made implementing the recommendations of the ARB a priority so that we can better prevent similar tragedies in the future. That's where we are focused at the State Department, and I know this is your priority as well. The unfortunate fact is our diplomats and facilities abroad will face attacks again, as they just did last week in Herat, Afghanistan. Since the tragic attacks in Benghazi, the tempo of threats and attacks against us has not diminished. We will do everything we can to deter and mitigate the effectiveness of any attack, but we will not, even with the most willing and capable governments as our partners, ever stop terrorists or extremists from mounting attacks against us in all cases. And we must continue to operate in places where host governments may not always be as willing or capable of fully defending us as we would wish. The risks to the United States as a nation, however, are greater if we withdraw than the risks that the brave U.S. diplomatic, development, and military personnel on the front lines of our foreign diplomacy efforts face. I appreciate that there is interest in Benghazi, from security to ARB implementation to accountability. And I'm here today to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to focus on the Benghazi Accountability Review Board, and I think the administration likes to characterize that as an independent board. But was that our board really independent? Because the Secretary of State selected 4 of the 5 members. The chairman of the board, Ambassador Pickering, has told congressional staff that you asked him for recommendations as to who else might serve with him on the board. Is that correct? You asked Ambassador Pickering for his recommendations as to who else might serve on the ARB board?
That is correct, sir.
There's also been reports that you played a role in selecting and assigning those department employees who staffed the board and assisted with its investigation. Did you, in fact, supervise the assignment of state employees to assist?
I had absolutely nothing to do with the assignment of staff to the board, sir. Absolutely nothing.
Well, I thank you. But here is a concern that we have in terms of the way it was staffed. A well-conducted investigation demands that there be sensible limitations on who can serve as an investigator. And the Benghazi ARB members and staff had too many ties, very close working relationships with those officials that they were charged with investigating. Consider, I think, these points. The Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Elizabeth Jones, not only worked with Ambassador Pickering at the State Department, but also served with him on 2 nonprofit boards. The ARB's lead staffer, also known as the ARB's Executive Director, had previously served as Chief of Staff to Deputy Secretary William Burns and had worked closely with a number of other senior department officials. These relationships can affect impartiality, and many State Department employees, including some who have testified before this Congress, have questioned the ARB's ability and willingness to conduct a truly unbiased investigation. That goes to the question of whether this really was an independent report. And the other aspect of this that is concerning is the way it has been packaged as independent. I think that in light of these facts, it is important going forward, given the Department's lack of accountability, that we change the procedure for the ARB so that, in fact, we have independent voices on it. Otherwise, you undermine the credible claims of independence, and you create an environment that is too clubby. And I think that the legislation that we have put forward will change that. I wanted your observation, support, or opposition to the measure that we're proposing in order to change the way in which ARB boards are conducted in the future.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that this was an independent investigation. If one reads, as I know you have, the very, very hard-hitting and very, very critical comments of the Accountability Review Board, as you noted in your opening statement, it is hard for me to accept the fact that the board was stacked as a State Department favorable board when they rendered the very, very critical opinions that they did read. 3 members of the board, Mr. Chairman, had no relationship at all with the State Department. All the members of the board had decades of experience working for both Republican and Democratic presidents over the period of time. It is impossible, I believe, to find someone with State Department senior expertise who could be a member of the board with the gravity, and someone with many years of experience and who is retired, who had not worked with people at the State Department.
Could I interrupt you just for a minute here?
Certainly,
I mean,
sir.
this is, we're here today because at the end of the day, no one is held accountable. And so that's contradictory to the thesis that you're advancing here. No one is held accountable.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully disagree about the subject of accountability. 4 employees of the State Department were relieved of their senior positions as assistant secretaries or deputy assistant secretaries of state and are no longer holding those senior positions. I submit respectfully, Mr. Chairman, that accountability includes being relieved from your job and assigned to other positions. To me, that is serious accountability.
Well, the reassignment, no one missed a paycheck, all right? No one has been held accountable, and the board did not take this to the upper levels of management, where clearly, for those who are observing from the outside, many of these decisions were made. And indeed, that's why we're here, is in order to try to change a system in which you have a hand in suggesting who does the investigation. It would be far wiser, and this is one of the most frustrating parts about dealing with this State Department. You went 4 years without the appointment internally of an investigator that would take on this responsibility. And in this process, we go through an ARB process in which you choose who's going to do the investigation. Afterwards, you move people from one position to another. They're on the paycheck, they're on the clock, whether they're working or not, through all of this. And there's no accountability in the process from our perspective in it. The idea that no one is held accountable at the end of the day is the problem, and reassignment just doesn't cut it in terms of addressing that issue. We're going to go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm more concerned with preventing another Benghazi-type attack in the future, rather than worrying about who was brought to justice, so to speak, for what they did or didn't do. I want to make sure that we do everything we can so that there are no future Benghazis. The State Department, led by Secretary Clinton and now Secretary Kerry, has put forward a lot of effort to improve how it plans and provides resources for diplomatic security over the past year. Bottom line, is the State Department doing a better job, in your opinion, at protecting the men and women serving around the world in dangerous locations than it was a year ago? And explain why. What have you learned? Obviously, things were problematic. What have we learned from our Benghazi experience that could not be repeated today because we've made changes?
Congressman, I think that one of the things that the Accountability Report called to our attention, which was very critical, was a question inherent potentially in the culture of the State Department, and is the focus of security only a management responsibility, or should the culture of a responsibility extend to all elements of the State Department? In other words, is security everyone's responsibility? And I think, as the Accountability Review Board pointed out, that was an issue. And we have taken steps there through assigning diplomatic security agents to brief the assistant secretaries every day, to be part of the assistant secretaries for the regional offices' morning staff meetings. Officers from all the regional bureaus attend the diplomatic security directors' morning briefings that lays out all the security issues that we are facing around the world. We appointed a Deputy Assistant Secretary in Diplomatic Security for high-threat posts so that we can focus specifically on those posts that are particularly endangered, so to speak, because of the world events in that part of the world. And that obviously is not a static situation. World conditions change, and our focus here has to be changed. And so we've also built in an institutional program so that a regular review of what are the highest and most threatened posts so that we can change our focus as the situation requires. Thanks to this Congress, we've achieved additional funding levels, and we are deploying. We've already deployed a number of Marine Security Guard detachments in endangered periods, and working with the United States Marine Corps, we are well on the route to increasing the number of Marine Security Guards to 35. And we've enhanced our training programs as well. So I think that there was a bell that was rung by the Accountability Review Board, and the State Department is taking many and varied steps to improve what we are doing, and many of those activities are already in place.
Let me ask you this. The Pickering-Mullen panel called for the establishment of multi-bureau support cells when opening or reopening a post, and legislation which I introduced was included in the authorization bill passed by our committee last month reflects this procedure. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, sir. It is clear that when you're going to open a post in an endangered area, to achieve security with a small s, it requires logistics, it requires construction, it requires telecommunications, it requires the right personnel with the right training. And these multi-unit support cells have already been established, and there is one already that is working on the situation. For example, should we have to go back into Syria at some point? The multi-concept support cell has already stood up and working on that question.
Let me ask you one final question. In your written testimony, you quote from a report completed by the Best Practices panel led by the former head of the Secret Service, Mark Sullivan. And one of those recommendations is that the Diplomatic Security Bureau be elevated and a new Undersecretary for Diplomatic Security be created. A similar change was approved by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright following the East Africa bombings in the late 1990s. However, changes were not made. What do you think about this recommendation? And if a new Undersecretary is not created, should the Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security report directly to the Secretary?
All assistant secretaries report directly to the Secretary. But given the demands on the Secretary of State's time, which is not infinite, there are a number of undersecretaries in the State Department who assist the Secretary of State Department in various channels, whether they be international political affairs, international economic affairs, arms control, and security. And so the undersecretaries, in my humble opinion, form an important assistance function to the Secretary in order that he or she has the right amount of time to focus on the most critical issues. We are still reviewing the results of the best practices, the Sullivan panel, but I might make one comment on the rationale for the current structure in the State Department. Security is not just the responsibility of the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. Security needs new facility construction. It needs security enhancement. It needs medical support. It needs telecommunications. It needs training. It needs logistics. It needs the right kind of recruiting tools. All those activities that are carried on in the State Department under the auspices of the Undersecretary for Management form the platform that provides a robust security capability at a post. And I believe it is very important that there be, on behalf of the Secretary of State, a coordinator. That is why the Department has organized itself as it has. But we will be looking at the recommendations of the Sullivan panel, but that is the reason why the Booz Allen Hamilton report, which was really a report on intelligence and security. And that report, when it said an undersecretary, would have also taken the Bureau of Intelligence and Research and the Counterterrorism Office and Diplomatic Security and put it all into one.
Thank you.
We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed pathetic that still no one has been held accountable for the disastrous decisions that were made at the State Department before, during, and after this terrorist attack. State continues to merely shuffle the deck chairs and employ officials who were part of the management deficiencies and systematic failures that were tragically made. Earlier this year, 2 senior officials resigned over the IRS scandal, yet no one has resigned, no one has been fired at State for the misguided decisions related to the September 11th, 2012 terrorist attacks. This is unacceptable and it is appalling. The administration is asking us to trust it when it says that it's doing everything it can to hold our people accountable for their pathetic roles in this tragedy and will bring those terrorists responsible to justice. Really? Who believes this? This is the same administration who deliberately politicized the talking points, set out a false narrative, denying that this was a terrorist attack and attributing blame to a video maker. Secretary Panetta has said that there was little communication with the White House and President Obama during the night of the attack. In this time of great need, was the president missing in action? The White House has failed to answer the question of where the president was, what he was doing during the attack, and why he failed to call for military backup. Greg Hicks, the former deputy chief of missions in Libya, testified that the administration gave a stand-down order to prevent a rescue team from going into Benghazi to help. Who gave that stand-down order? Can you describe the coordination between the White House, Secretary Clinton, and Secretary Panetta to give our personnel immediate support and assistance? Did anyone even lift a finger? Libya was a high-threat post, and this should have made continued security requests of our personnel an urgent priority within the department, and those requests should have been granted immediately. It was not a question of funding or capabilities. Their requests were not granted because people failed to do their job. What assurances can you give us that another high-threat post, as we speak, is not currently urgently asking for additional security, additional support, and that they are being ignored as well? What protocols are now in place to prevent this from happening again? The ARB recommended that State establish a panel of outside independent experts with experience in high-risk, high-threat areas to identify best practices and evaluate U.S. security platforms. What are those recommendations? In January, I asked Secretary Clinton for an itemized funding layout and justification of how the department was going to enforce and implement, as she said, all of the 64 recommendations from the ARB. I've not received that detailed report. This summer, as we know, the department closed over 20 embassies and consulates in the Middle East and North Africa. We should condition aid to host nations based on their full cooperation with the U.S. on implementing a plan that will protect our Foreign Service officers and ambassadors overseas. So I ask you, sir, what about the stand-down order? What was the coordination between the White House and Secretaries Clinton and Panetta? And what about the implementation of the recommendations, all 64?
Thank you very much. I hesitate to speak for the President of the United States, but what I have been briefed on is that this is what the White House has outlined. As soon as the President learned of the attack on our temporary mission facility in Benghazi, he immediately acted to ensure that our military and national security staff could secure and assist our embassies around the globe and reinforce our...
Can you answer who gave the stand-down order? Do you have any information?
There was no
stand.
There was no.
What about the
There was
coordination?
no, if I could, ma'am, there was no stand on our, I'd be glad to.
Thank you. What about the coordination between the Department of State, the White House, and Secretary Panetta?
There was coordination all night. The call came in at about 3:45 p.m. in the afternoon, Washington time, and the State
And who
Department-
decided that there was no reason to help, or they had no capabilities, or they had no resources to help?
The U.S. military was put on alert. A fast Marine platoon from one location.
How long did this firefight take place, this terrorist attack? How many hours?
The attack on the temporary mission facility.
Was it 8 hours?
No, the attack on the temporary mission facility was about an hour, and then there was about a 6-hour lag, and then there was about a 15-minute second attack.
So 7
on the
hours
annex.
plus. And so during
That's
that
correct.
time,
The nearest U.S. military forces were in Djibouti.
and in
on the
7
other-
hours,
The distance from Djibouti to
Really?
Benghazi is about the distance from Washington to Dallas, Texas.
it would have been impossible, you think?
There
that
were
it-
no, yes,
there was-
there were no
in
U.S.
7+ hours.
There were
There
no
was
U.S.
nothing that we could do. So
There-
that's the message that we're sending to our embassies. When you're in trouble,
No.
7+ hours, we're in the 1930s, we can't get to you.
No, Congresswoman. We have been working with the Department of Defense, but there are only so many Department of Defense military installations around the world, and the distances from those installations, the reason why that is relevant and important goes to our request and your help in increasing the funding to allow.
Thank you very much. As was pointed out, and I know I'm over, it was just not a problem of funding. And the ARB states it, and every witness has said it. It was not a problem of lack of funding. It was a problem of lack of resolve to do something about the problem that lasted more than 7 hours. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go to Mr. Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And unfortunately, Ambassador Kennedy, all of what we've just heard in those line of questioning that you just had, we've heard it. They've been asked before at other hearings that we've had. ARB has covered it. So here we go again with the same questions, the same thing again. And you were cut off, I don't know, so to just give you an opportunity, if there's something else that you want to say. I know you've heard these questions 1,000 times, and people just don't want to know the correct answers. But if there's something else that you want to add on to that, please do so.
Thanks. I would like to cover the funding question if I could. The Accountability Review Board was correct about funding, but there are two types of funding. There is sort of micro-funding and macro-funding. The State Department responded to every single one of the requests for increased security enhancements in Benghazi, and I would be glad to submit for the record a list of all the security enhancements that we put into place in Benghazi. Increasing the wall, alarm systems, cameras, barbed wire, drop-arm barriers to make sure that bomb-laden vehicles could not crash into the building. So all the micro enhancements for Benghazi that they requested were attended to. Then there is the macro question, Congressman, and that is that the best defense is to ability to construct the new facilities that you have provided us additional funds for. Subsequent to the attack on Benghazi, there was a major attack on our compound in Tunisia, and there was a major attack on our compound in Khartoum. Those buildings held out, and not a single American was killed or injured for over 8 hours until host nation security forces mobilized to defend us. But those buildings in Khartoum and in Tunisia were the new modern buildings that we have had the assistance of the Congress and the funding to build. It's just that on a macro sense, because of the increase in the value of the dollar and because of inflation worldwide, the program that we started after Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, we were building 8 embassies a year then. Because of the decrease in funding, we're building 3. Thanks to your help, the funding is now back up to 8.
Thank you. Now, let's just try to move forward a little bit. I mean, and I wish that this hearing was about moving forward and talking about how we can make sure that we support our diplomats in a better way. And as the department continues to implement recommendations of the ARB, I was talking, a number of diplomats seem to be worried about some of the new security protocols that may inhibit or limit their ability to engage with the local community, reach out to key contacts, and establish much-needed relationships to do their jobs well. How can we balance the need for more security precautions and the ability of diplomats to reach the local community and do their jobs?
I think that is something that the State Department works very hard on. And there have been a number of articles in the popular press over the last few years that describe fortress embassies that are unavailable to the local populace. I think they have actually the purpose and the operating style of an American embassy and our diplomatic and other agencies abroad absolutely backwards. Our diplomats go out of the embassy. We don't, except for consular operations, we don't demand that people come to see us in our homes. We go to their home. We go to the foreign ministry. We go to the Ministry of Education. We visit the journalists. So our people go out all the time. But if there's a crisis brewing in a country that comes up, overnight, a coup or other dangers, what we need is a place that our diplomats can, in effect, hunker down in. And those are the new embassy compounds that we have been building with your money. So the new steps we are taking, sir, combined with additional diplomatic security professionals and additional armored vehicles, will continue to allow our people to go out but have a safe base.
And let me just ask this in the few remaining seconds I have left. What about working, have we changed, or have we, we have to work with host governments?
Yes.
Has the department changed or implemented any new procedures in working with these host governments, because they have some responsibility for security also, especially how do we mitigate the risk of working in a country where there's ongoing conflict or instability?
We work very closely with host nations. That is one of the principal responsibilities of our regional security officers. We also partner with the Department of Defense, which has a number of programs which train local host nation security forces. The State Department also has, under the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, training programs between the Bureau of Diplomatic Security that brings foreign national police leaders to the United States for training. So this partnership is ongoing, and we are working to enhance it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Go now to Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. Let me ask you a few questions, if I could. Were you or Secretary Clinton aware of the compelling need for more diplomatic security? And this would parallel what Secretary Madeleine Albright's repeated denial of security requests, which led to our Nairobi embassy being bombed, as well as our embassy in Dar es Salaam. And as you will recall, Ambassador Bushnell repeatedly asked for assistance and did not get it. The ARB did not interview Madeleine Albright. It did not interview her senior staff. It did interview you, because you were Assistant Secretary at the time. And it seems to me that we stop at the Assistant Secretary level when the people who probably have even more knowledge and certainly are to be held for responsible accounting of what they did or did not do. I asked the Secretary of State a very straightforward question, and she said the information did not come to her attention about the security needs. Is that true? And did you know about any of the requests through any means, whether it be cables, conversations, about Ambassador Stevens' requests for, and others at the embassy, for more security help? Were you unaware of it?
Congressman, except for one request, which I'll touch on in a second, all the requests that were filed by our embassy in Tripoli on behalf of the temporary mission facility in Benghazi were met. They asked for funding for concrete Jersey barriers to increase the perimeter. They asked for 4 steel drop arms in order to make sure that cars could not crash through the gate. They asked for increased compound lighting. They asked
who knew about these requests? That's my only question. Not what they asked for. Who knew about it? You?
These requests, since they were all met, I believe I was generally aware that they were.
So there was no request that went unanswered, you're saying?
Except for one. There was a request that was debated about whether or not we should erect massive guard towers.
Okay. Now, did the Secretary of State know about any of that?
No, because the requests were being met. I don't.
So let me just ask you, why wasn't the senior staff and why wasn't the Secretary of State interviewed by the ARB?
That is a question.
We've asked it, we've gotten poor
That's a
answers
question,
from
Congressman.
Ambassador Pickering.
You'll have to ask the ARB.
So did you convey any emails or any information you might have had to the ARB in any way?
I was, other than the reference of talking to Ambassador Pickering after he had been set.
So you were interviewed
chairman,
informally?
I was. There are press reports that I was never interviewed. That is categorically false. I was formally interviewed.
Then why
For
wouldn't they
almost 2
include
hours.
that? Are you listed on the list of interviewees?
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you, if I could, the deployment of foreign emergency support teams. Who made that decision not to deploy? Was the request made, and who made the decision not to deploy?
I was asked, did I, in my role as the management official of the State Department, need the FEST to be deployed? And I said no for 2 reasons. One, by the time the FEST is not a military response unit. It is a command and control airplane, the kind that we did send to Nairobi after.
So was a request made, and did you approve it or deny it?
I was asked the decision is an interagency decision. I was simply asked, do I need the capabilities of the FEST? And since it did not bring any military assets to bear, it was based in the U.S. and would have taken at least 16 or 18 hours.
Because I don't have much time. Let me ask you,
Mr.
Mr. Ambassador, why was the CIA security team repeatedly ordered to stand down after the attack began, and who made that decision?
I am not aware of any CIA security team being ordered to stand down, sir.
So why weren't assets that were in close proximity to the attack deployed to try to assist our beleaguered and now murdered ambassador?
There was no stand-down order, sir. There was never a stand-down order.
Let me ask you a question. How many Benghazi survivors were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements?
The State Department does not tell people to sign non-disclosure agreements.
Were people, are you aware of non-disclosure agreements, and how many are there?
I am not aware of any non-disclosure.
Could you tell us where the Benghazi survivors are, since access to them has been very, very difficult?
One Benghazi survivor was seriously injured in the second attack and is still in the hospital. The other 4 have resumed duties around the world.
Now, can I ask you, with regards to those who, as my colleagues have, particularly Ileana Russell-Layton and the chairman, have so eloquently stated, 4 people get censored. They apparently keep receiving a full pay for a vacation. You know, it appears, you know, there was that famous scene in the fictional Clear and Present Danger, where the president tells, in the John Clancy novel, it's the old Potomac two-step. People at a lower level take the hit, while other people who were in the know or should have been in the know walk and are never even interviewed. How do you respond to that? I mean, to the American public and to members on both sides of the aisle, we are concerned that the lessons learned, because I chaired the hearings on the ARB and actually wrote a law to beef up our embassy security. I was the prime sponsor of it, and it is law. And yet we still have a situation where we haven't learned, you know, more than a dozen years later, and the very people who should be held accountable aren't even interviewed. That's appalling.
There are several questions there. Let me try to take them in sequence. You ask about accountability. With respect to the 4 individuals, I believe that they were held accountable by relieving them of their position. One of them actually resigned as Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security. So
they got paid the whole entire time of their resignation? Where did they work? What did they do? Did they go home? Did they come to the department every day?
Congressman, it is, I believe, an essential element of American fairness that I know this committee fully supports, because I've seen many of the legislation pieces that you've authored that say that a person is entitled to a review. And what Secretary Kerry did was engage.
Now, did they initiate a review? I know I'm out of time. They themselves? Did they initiate a review and say we've been unfairly censored?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, before the clock, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the clock starts ticking, I would request that I be granted the same amount of time as my colleague from New Jersey, Mr.
Without objection?
I thank the Chair. I also want to thank the Chair for the tone in which he began this hearing with a very thoughtful statement. He's quite correct. All committees of Congress, it seems to me, ought to follow your advice, which is try to understand what happened and try to make sure we take whatever measures we can to prevent its recurrence, not to exploit it for partisan political gain. I've been involved in this town for a long time. I was on the Senate committee staff when the tragedy of Lebanon occurred, where our embassy blew up not once but twice on Ronald Reagan's watch. I don't remember people calling for heads to roll. I don't remember an ARB review of what happened, although there should have been one. We understood that was a national tragedy, and we came together. I wish more of our colleagues would follow the spirit in which you've set the tone of this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for doing so. I would ask unanimous consent also that my full statement, including the Appendix B, entered into the record at this point.
Without objection?
I thank the Chair. And by the way, part of that is a statement called Fact versus Fiction, prepared by the Oversight and Government Reform Committee staff, that lays out many of the commonly repeated accusations about Benghazi that just aren't true. Mr. Ambassador, by the way, my good friend from Florida, Ms. Ileana Layton, would have us believe money played absolutely no role in the decision about security allocations around the world.
The gentleman would yield. That is not my statement. Those are the witnesses' testimony and the ARB report
I
itself.
would remind my colleague that she and I were actually at a briefing together where I put that very question to Ambassador Pickering, and he most certainly did acknowledge that, of course, money plays a role. Sometimes when people say it's not about money, it's about money. Let me just ask, Mr. Kennedy, if I got my facts right, in FY 2011, this Congress cut $327 million from the request for diplomatic security, construction and maintenance?
I believe that is the correct figure.
$327 million. The following fiscal year, this same Congress cut another $183 million from the request. Is that correct?
I believe that is the correct amount.
And then in FY 2013, it cut $145 million. Is that correct?
I believe that is the correct amount, sir.
And we kind of came to our senses only after the tragedy of Benghazi and restored some of those fundings and gave the State Department more flexibility in the end. Is that correct?
That is correct and deeply appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The idea that money doesn't play a role is simply not true. The chairman indicated in his opening statement that, and he's quite right about accountability, and I think all of us are a little troubled about that, but he also was talking about the follow-up to the Benghazi tragedy, and he said no one's been captured or killed. And I deeply respect the chairman of this committee, but I find it ironic the implicit criticism of an administration that did what the previous administration could not do for 7 years. They captured and killed the man who perpetrated the tragedy of 9/11, the memorial of which we just remembered. What is the status of the Benghazi follow-up that you can share with us? Are we going to hold, we're talking about accountability within the State Department, how about accountability for the terrorists who perpetrated this heinous crime and engineered the death of our 4 brave fellow Americans?
As the President and the Secretary have said, we are engaged in every effort to bring the terrorists to justice. This is under the purview of the FBI, assisted by the State Department and by the intelligence community. And from the briefings that I've received, which unfortunately I cannot go into in detail in this setting, the FBI and others are engaged in a full court press on this. No one is leaving any stone unturned to bring these individuals to justice.
What about Libyan security? Part of the problem on that terrible day was, frankly, Libyan security, the responsibility of the host government, kind of dissolved. What's the status of that?
The State Department and the Department of Defense are working with the government of Libya to get them a security force that is capable of doing doing the job that they are required to do under the Vienna Convention. But in the interim period of time, we have reinforced our embassy in Tripoli with a significant number of State Department personnel and a significant number of U.S. military personnel who are on scene now.
And the status of our mission in Benghazi?
Our mission in Benghazi is closed.
Is that because of the security status?
Because of the security situation, there is not, there's nothing that we could do at the moment to mitigate the security risk of a reopened presence there, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think I still have more time. Yeah, thank you. With respect to the ARB, in your opinion, this was a rigorous and hard-hitting report. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is there anything with respect to the recommendations of findings that the State Department is not following up on and not trying to implement?
No, sir. We are working through every single one. There are 29 recommendation, and as the representative from Florida indicated, we have broken that up into 64 separate tasks in order that we can manage the process as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we are working through every single one of them. We have completed many of them. Others take time because they involve construction or other matters, but there is nothing that we are lagging on.
By the way, this issue of whether an order was given to stand down the U.S. military, so that preventing the military from responding, and I've heard you say several times, not true, no such order was ever given. I would just like to make a point for the record that our colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee this summer issued a press release from the majority staff that said, in his testimony, LTC Gibson clarified his responsibilities and actions during the attack. Contrary to news reports, Gibson was not ordered to stand down by higher command authorities in response to his understandable desire to lead a group of 3 other Special Forces soldiers to Benghazi.
That statement has also been corroborated by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, who has also testified that there was no stand-down order given.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. We go now to Mr. Rohrbacher of California.
Before my time starts running here, I would request to have the same amount of time as my good friend from Virginia.
May I suggest that members on the Democratic and Republican side, I've kept copious notes here, and I know exactly how much time everyone's gone over, and we're dead even. And because we have a lot of freshmen on this committee, we are now going to hold everyone to 5 minutes, but I'm going to start the clock right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Let us hope that this hearing is a step forward in our effort to break down what I consider to be a wall of deceit and denial in an attempt to hide the truth from the American people about this Benghazi attack. It's been over a year, and the American people have a right to know the truth, and they deserve to know it. And this idea that there's been a full-court press going on, it's over a year now since our ambassador was murdered, along with the other brave Americans who died that night. And don't tell me that's a full-court press when we haven't even pointed our finger at the people, at the organization, and the finger at the people who actually murdered these people. I don't know what a full-court press means with that. About funding, with all due respect to my friend from Virginia, Assistant Secretary Lamb, who was responsible for making the decisions as to security level in Benghazi, testified here, and I know because it was my question specifically, did budget considerations play any role in the decision as to what level security would be at in Benghazi? She said no. And just for the record, she, by saying no and making sure that it was a matter of policy and not budget, she's been one of the ones relieved of her position. Wonder why she got relieved of her position after she was able to testify something like that before Congress. Mr. Ambassador, we need to know a number of things. I'm going to go through some questions for you. You know, was there an autopsy conducted on Ambassador Stevens' body? Yes or no?
Yes, it was conducted by the U.S. military at Dover Air Force Base, sir.
Right. Is that autopsy, when there are homicides committed against American citizens, are those autopsies then permitted to be made public to, for example, congressional investigations?
I will have to, the autopsy was turned over to the FBI, which was the investigating agency. I was informed by the FBI at one point that he died of smoke inhalation.
Well, I'm not asking what he died of. I said, right now, if there is an autopsy, is that being kept from congressional investigators?
I will take that question back to the
All
FBI,
right.
sir.
When you talk about military units not being dispatched, that there was no stand-down order and that they weren't sent because it wasn't enough time. Let me put you on the record. Let me put myself on the record on this point, and that is, no one knew how long this attack was going to exist and go on. We don't know how long would this attack last. Anybody who did not dispatch troops or dispatch aid or assistance of some kind to our ambassador who was under attack had no idea whether it was going to be a 1-hour battle, a 4-hour battle, or a 2-day battle. And for not dispatching help, that's a dereliction of some type of responsibility. You keep saying our military team was not ordered to stand down. Were there other American government employees, perhaps of the CIA, in Benghazi at that time who could have gone to our ambassador's assistance? Were they ordered to stand down?
No, there was a team from the annex that did go to the temporary mission facility and did relieve the pressure on that facility. And subsequently,
they were ordered, and apparently those 2 Navy SEALs that got there were ordered not to go. Is that correct?
no, sir, I'm not aware. I am not aware of that at all.
All right.
A quick
Not
reaction.
aware, not aware doesn't mean no.
No, sir, I mean no. A quick reaction team went from the annex to the temporary mission facility main building, and then all of them, and then the annex was reinforced by the 5 State Department
So there was
security
no,
officers.
so there was no stand-on order even to CIA personnel who were there. Okay, now, who made the choice to create this fictitious narrative that it was a demonstration that got out of hand and not a terrorist attack? Now, we know from the first minutes of this attack, we've been told they knew that this was a terrorist attack, yet for a full week, we had top-level people in this administration claiming it was a movie rage, a demonstration that got out of attack. Who created that narrative?
I don't know if I can answer the question of who created. I can tell you, though, sir, that the narrative about the movie did cause an attack on the American embassy in Cairo.
You can't answer the question.
We're going to have to go to Mr. Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Kennedy, for being here. And I've had the opportunity, as others, to listen to the testimony of Ambassador Pickering and Chairman Mullen to review the report and the recommendations and to hear testimony in these last several hearings. And I thank you for your testimony today and for being here. And my first question is that 29 recommendations that involve 64 different tasks, which seem to me very comprehensive. I agree with your assessment that this was a hard-hitting report and really do respect the work that was done and the thoroughness of the report. And as those recommendations are being implemented and those tasks are being completed, are there any things that we can do, Congress can do, to facilitate the implementation of those recommendations, or are there any obstacles presently in the way that we should respond to be sure that the work you are doing, the department is doing, to implement those can continue appropriately?
I think the most important thing is the pass as the President's budget request for embassy construction and security that is in the FY14 budget request. That will give us the resources to continue implementing the ARB's recommendation, including the necessary new construction and upgrades we need to protect our people. There's second, and is We have the authority only in certain locations around the world to do what is called best value contracting for guards. We now are forced in many locations to take the lowest bidder. Having that in an authorization bill that I know that this committee is working on would be very, very helpful to the department in getting the best kind of local security forces possible.
And, you know, every time we have a hearing on this issue, we have to always begin remembering the brave American heroes whose lives were lost, and I think our solemn obligation to do everything that we can to prevent this kind of tragedy from ever occurring again and protecting individuals who are representing our country all over the world. And to follow up on my friend from Virginia's point, the panel in this report found, and I quote, a more serious and sustained commitment from Congress and called on a more serious and sustained commitment from Congress to support State Department needs, which in total constitute a small percentage both of the full national budget and that spent for national security. One overall conclusion in this report is that Congress must do its part to meet this challenge and provide necessary resources to the State Department to address security risks and meet mission imperatives. And as an aside, in fiscal year 2011, the budget passed by our leadership on the House side provided $327 million less for State Department security than was proposed by the Senate. And in fiscal year 2012, the year of this attack, the House Republicans proposed almost $200 million less for State Department security than the Senate. So this notion that resourcing is important in keeping our diplomatic corps safe is something that was identified in the report, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And finally, would you address for a moment, you know, the department is obviously operating in very high-risk, high-threat locations all over the world, with including places with a lack of clearly defined and capable security support from host nations and all of the problems that arise from that. And this raises security risks for our diplomatic corps and development experts, but also imposes particular strains on our existing resources. And should we as a Congress begin to think differently, working with the executive about ways that we plan and appropriately manage these requirements, sort of in the changing landscape of the really high-risk, high-threat locations that we now serve all around the world?
I think this is an effort that has to be undertaken jointly by the executive branch and the Congress. The State Department, as I believe is outlined in my longer statement, has made changes on how we look at high-threat, high-risk posts. And I think the two things that are needed there are, as was pointed out, we need to continue to work with host nations to help increase their capability through additional training of their security forces in their capital cities or other places, and we need additional appropriations, and the bill that is passed out of the Appropriations Subcommittee in the House does exactly that, because if we can construct facilities of the like that we had in Khartoum and in Tunis in the attacks that took place right after 9/11, those buildings held off the attackers, and our people will remain safe.
Which is, you know, it's important that we hold the terrorists responsible for this activity accountable, that the State Department personnel who were relieved of their duties, but also Congress has a responsibility to fulfill our obligations in ensuring that the resources are available to keep our diplomatic corps safe. And I thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to go now to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get right to some questions, but I do want to address something that's troubled me for some time. I'm speaking about the hoops that this committee has had to jump through to get the facts surrounding the murders of 4 of our finest public servants. The State Department has delayed and delayed coming forth with information on this matter, and when we were finally presented with some relevant data a few months ago, it clearly amounted to what many would call a document dump. Thousands of pages of paper in wide disarray and in no particular order, either in terms of relevance or chronology, making it very difficult to actually locate documents that were helpful. I brought this up with Secretary Clinton. She wasn't particularly responsive. You're welcome to weigh in if you'd like to.
As I understand it, sir, the State Department was asked for every document that it possessed which was relevant to Benghazi. And when we received such a request, we try to give out everything for fear, to be blunt, of being accused of holding something back. So this generates, when you have worldwide security efforts in something as complex as Benghazi, this generates many, many
All right, well, it was
cubic feet of documents.
it was a
which we-
total mess and not particularly helpful. Let me go on because I've got a limited time. On August 23rd, the State Department sent a letter to the committee which stated the ARB was, quote, very clear that the only people responsible for the lethal attack on our special mission compound in Benghazi were the terrorists who orchestrated the attack. These terrorists must be brought to justice. The entire U.S. government remains committed to doing just that, unquote. Now, no one will argue who was directly to blame for the attacks that resulted in the deaths of those 4 Americans, but as the ARB and numerous congressional hearings have revealed, there are other people who need to be held accountable for the fact that the terrorist attacks succeeded. But by the language of this letter, does the State Department really want us to believe that the department's bureaucracy could have done nothing more to protect our diplomats?
That was not the finding of the ARB, and the actions that are referenced in the August 23rd letter, sir, we are essentially reaffirming the findings and the recommendations of the ARB. The 4 individuals were held accountable, but because
All right, we'll get into that in a
they were
minute, but-
relieved of their positions.
All right,
and one of them resigned.
when former Secretary of State Clinton testified in January, she stated repeatedly and took responsibility for the attacks. In fact, she stated, again, I'll quote, as I have said multiple times, I take responsibility and nobody is more committed to getting this right, unquote. Do you believe Secretary Clinton has been held truly accountable for failures under her watch?
I think what the ARB did was take from the original intent of the Congress, which established the ARB, because the Congress and the legislative history
That's
made
not
it
what I asked.
No,
I asked you if you thought that Secretary Clinton has been truly held accountable, yes or no?
She said she was responsible, and I am not going to challenge her statement. But
Where's the accountability, though?
Congress, there is in every organization, every cabinet department, every agency, in effect, a line of authority. There are people who set the policy, and there are those who then implement that policy or go back up to senior leadership and say the policy cannot be implemented.
All right, let me move on. Admiral Pickering described 4 the State Department employees as having, quote, failed in the performance of their duties, unquote, with respect to Benghazi. Now, let me get this straight, and I know this has been covered before, but I think it's very important. The only disciplinary action meted out to the 4 who failed in the performance of their duties was being put on administrative leave for a while, then reassigned to other positions within the State Department. Now, their benefits as federal employees continued during that time. Of course, they are going to be subject to Obamacare, so arguably that benefit is worse. And they haven't missed a paycheck. Is that about right? I mean, it seems like pretty pitiful discipline to me.
Sir, I believe that being an assistant secretary at any cabinet office or being a deputy assistant secretary at any cabinet office is a senior position of grave and great responsibility. To be relieved of your position in that regard, I believe is a serious act of accountability.
Let me conclude by saying that I think that failing to call Secretary Clinton to actually interview her was a gross oversight by the ARB and is really almost incomprehensible that they didn't call her as a witness. You don't need to respond. I yield back.
Well, just in point of clarification, because this was brought up with Secretary Kerry when he was here, the comment that Mr. Shabbat made about the documents, and this, I think, affects us all on the committee, we are still in a position where those documents, as you know, are not, a copy is not made available to us. We can't copy those documents. You can go down there, somebody can see a document, but we can't make copies of them. We've asked for a set of those documents. And when we asked the Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry said, that's no policy of mine when we raised our objection to this. This is one of the reasons this is ongoing, because we don't have copies of those documents. So again, we would like to have copies of the documents turned over to this committee. Thank you, Ambassador. We go now to Mr. Alan Grayson of Florida.
Ambassador, I'd like to ask you a few questions about Benghazi, the scandal that never was. Who decided that Ambassador Stevens go to Benghazi on September 11, 2012?
It was the ambassador's decision, sir.
Now, was Secretary Clinton responsible in any way for reviewing and approving the in-country movements of U.S. ambassadors, either Ambassador Stevens or anyone else?
No, sir. Under departmental policy, ambassadors only need Washington permission if they leave their country of assignment, not the capital city.
Now, did the ambassador, when he went to Benghazi, have a normal security detail in accordance with the State Department procedures and rules at that time?
Yes, sir. He had two diplomatic security special agents who accompanied him from Tripoli to Benghazi.
Benghazi was a diplomatic post, not an embassy, right?
It was a temporary mission facility. Yes, sir.
All right. Is it even possible to provide the same kind of security at a temporary mission facility as we try to provide at our embassies?
We can never achieve the kind of perfect security that we need other than a purpose-built embassy. We have a series of standards, and we were working through those standards. We were constantly adding, as I think in response to the gentleman from Virginia, I offered to submit for the record a list of all the improvements that we had made to the temporary mission facility in Benghazi.
Was there any money that was appropriated for the purpose of improving that post that was unspent at that time?
No, sir. There was no specific money appropriated from Benghazi. We were simply taking money from other locations, but all the requests that they put forward, as I mentioned, save one, which is the guard towers, which were determined to be unnecessary and potentially too attention-getting, all their requests were fulfilled.
Now, with regard to the attack itself, approximately how long was it between the time that the attack began and the time of the ambassador's unfortunate death?
I would say it was probably somewhere, it was definitely under 90 minutes.
Now, was there any kind of military force, substantial U.S. military force, close enough to even engage the attackers within that 90-minute period?
No, sir.
Was there any force, even if there had been more time, that could have rescued the ambassador given the actual situation on the ground as it was?
Tragically, no, sir.
Did the White House ever ignore any reports regarding this attack?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of.
Did Secretary Clinton ever ignore any reports regarding this attack?
No, sir. I personally spoke to Secretary Clinton that evening, and Secretary Clinton was being constantly briefed by our Operations Center all evening.
If you had been the President of the United States on that night, would you have done anything different?
What I know that the President did was to say to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, do everything that you can. And I think that's probably what I would have done was turn to my senior military command authority and tell them to do whatever was necessary, which is what he did.
Regarding the Accountability Review Board report, did the Accountability Review Board find Secretary Clinton in any way liable for any kind of misconduct?
No, sir.
Did the board find the President liable for any kind of misconduct?
No, sir.
Was it, in fact, within their powers to have done so if they felt that that were the case?
They certainly could have found the Secretary of State because their charge is to review State Department operations. I am not sure that their writ legislatively, legally extended outside the State Department, but it certainly extended to the Secretary of State.
Ambassador, are you familiar with the term second-guessing? Have you heard that term before?
Yes, sir.
What about the term 20/20 hindsight? Have you heard that term before?
Yes, sir.
And how about the term Monday morning quarterbacking? Have you heard that term before?
Yes, sir.
Good. I yield the rest of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, for your leadership to seek explanations for the murders of 4 heroic Americans in Benghazi. It's imperative that we fully understand where the systemic breakdown occurred within the State Department so that no more American Foreign Service members die while serving our country. I agree with Congressman Rohrabacher of California. There's been deceit and denial. Mr. Kennedy, I appreciate your attendance today. At a Senate hearing previously, you acknowledged that you denied an extension of a 16-person security support team, SST. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that was the team that was based in Tripoli, not in Benghazi, sir. It was a Tripoli assignment. They were never assigned to Benghazi.
But they
And
would.
if I might, but I don't want to take your time.
Yeah, no, please.
When we first went back into Tripoli, our embassy had been burnt out in Tripoli, so we turned to the Department of Defense and asked them for assistance. 2 of their officers went in with 2 of ours, and we did a survey. We then asked for 16 Department of Defense personnel. And over the course of standing up the embassy, those individuals worked themselves out of a job. And in fact, they sent medics, they sent communications personnel. We replaced them with State Department personnel. They sent someone to do helicopter landing zone surveys and to look for unexploded ordnance. They did their mission, and therefore there was no mission left for them to accomplish. There were 8, in effect, security personnel. The State Department also replaced those security personnel with personnel on the State Department roles. However, on the night in question, even though this is Tripoli, not Benghazi, 6 of those positions were still based in Benghazi in Tripoli, excuse me, performing other missions. And those are the 6 that several members have referred to. And so the 6 were still there.
And indeed, we're talking about people within the same country. And so it's just really sad to me that there was not protection given or defense to the 4 Americans killed. Additionally, the security support team's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Wood, testified before Congress last year that the team was created, quote, to meet the demanding security challenges facing the Department of State, and that they loaned considerable support to the State Department's security position in this uncertain and volatile environment. Additionally, on October 2012, Regional Security Officer Eric Nordstrom stated that retaining the security team was a primary issue until other security resources became available. Given this testimony, what justification do you have for the denial of the extension of the security support team, given the commander and regional security officer's belief that the team was a necessity?
It's exactly what the regional security officer said, until other resources became available, and the State Department replaced the security part of that team, with State Department regional security officers and trained other personnel that we had on the embassy compound. So they worked their way out of a job, which is the case when we borrow personnel from the Defense Department and then we replace them with State Department assets.
Well, it's hard to imagine they worked their way out of a job when 4 people died.
But that was Tripoli, sir.
Yes,
not Benghazi.
Hey, same
We're
country.
not in Benghazi.
Same country, and the availability should have been made possible. Additionally, I'm very appreciative that Chairman Ed Royce has introduced an Accountability Review Board Reform Act of 2013, H.R. 1768. It's for effectiveness for future accountability review boards. What is the State Department view of Chairman Royce's bill?
We have provided comments back, and I will be glad to make sure that I make a copy of that available to you, sir. May I say one more thing about Benghazi?
Yes, please.
If anybody had asked me to reassign the SST from Tripoli 400 miles away to Benghazi, I might have considered that, but since no one ever asked for their relocation, it was the question is, had they completed their mission in Tripoli? And they had completed their mission in Tripoli, and no one asked for a reassignment to Benghazi.
Regardless of the assignment, within the same country now, 400 miles, I just have to tell you that I would hope that every resource, whatever it is, of any means, that it would be provided to protect American lives and American Foreign Service employees so brave and heroic. Thank you.
I certainly agree with that, sir. Thank you.
We go to Mr. Juan Vargas of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for holding this hearing. Ambassador, thank you, too, for being here. My first question is this, and you've answered partially. We did have 4 lives that were lost, 4 American heroes, and you said that we were doing everything that we could to catch the perpetrators, because the perpetrators here really are the terrorists. What can you tell us today that's unclassified that we're doing to try to catch them? Because that's, I think, where the American people are. What are we doing to catch these murderers?
The FBI, the intelligence community, the State Department are doing everything it can, and unfortunately, the details, sir, would have to come from my colleagues at the FBI in closed session, but they are engaged in a total effort to catch them.
Well, that's, I think, the important thing, that there has to be a total effort, because I think when I'm back home, that's what they're asking. They see the bickering back and forth here, but they want to make sure that we are, in fact, trying to get the terrorists that committed these acts.
The President has said to state, justice, the intelligence community, defense, this is a task, and we are on it.
Well, let me go then to the ARB itself. There's been a lot of criticism here of the ARB, a wall of deceit, denial. I wrote down a whole bunch of notes here. The 2 people that headed it up was Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mike Mullen. I remember Ambassador Pickering, of course, because he was the ambassador to El Salvador for a while. I think he was appointed there by Ronald Reagan. I didn't agree with the policies there at the time. I was a Jesuit at the time. I did not appreciate what we were doing. But anyway, that being said, I've followed his career, and he's somewhat of a Sergei Lavrov for Americans. He was probably our most sophisticated foreign policy expert, and there's been a lot of criticism of the ARB. Could you criticize or not criticize him or this ARB report? Because I find it somewhat interesting, since he was, I don't know if he was a Republican or Democrat, but he seemed to be appointed mostly by Republicans.
I mean, I think the membership of including an officer appointed by the Director of National Intelligence, Ambassador Pickering with his long service under, as you note, both Republican and Democratic presidents, Admiral Michael Mullen, who rose to the ranks of Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, service under Republican, Democratic presidents, Catherine Bertini, long service in both, I believe it was in the Bush administration at the Department of Agriculture and at the United Nations. And so this compilation of individuals represents the full spectrum, I believe, and as I mentioned earlier, when you read the report, it is not complimentary of the State Department.
I did read the report. It was not complimentary, but do you think that Ambassador Pickering then was not up to the task here? Is there some reason why you would criticize him and say that they picked the wrong person? This a person's not capable of doing a proper ARB?
No, sir.
Why would you say no?
Because of his experience as serving as an ambassador, as the Undersecretary of State, as U.S. Representative of the United Nations, and in assignments as difficult as Israel, the then Soviet Union, El Salvador.
Is he deceitful? Is he underhanded? Is he sly? Is he any of these other things?
No, sir.
Let's go to Admiral Mullen then. Admiral Mullen, do you think he was someone that was competent to serve on this board?
I have had the pleasure of working with Admiral Mullen somewhat when he represented the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in senior level meetings, and I find him to be a very hard-hitting, a very intelligent, and a very reputable person.
Do you think he's underhanded, deceitful, sly, in any way trying to cover up here?
No, sir.
Why do you say that?
It's the nature of his career and the position to which he rose to.
Those are my questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. We go now to Mike McCall from Texas.
I thank the chairman and welcome Ambassador. Prior to the attacks in Benghazi and the killing of our ambassador, there were many warning signs and many cries for help. April 6, 2012, a crude IED was thrown over the wall of the U.S. facility in Benghazi. On May 22nd, Red Cross building attacked by the Brigades of the Blind Sheikh, the 93 World Trade Center mastermind. June 6, the consulate was targeted by an IED attack that blew a hole in the perimeter. Credit, again, by the Brigades of the Blind Sheikh. And June 11th, the British ambassador escapes a narrow death. March 28th, then Ambassador Kretz sends a cable to Secretary Clinton requesting additional assets. That cable request is denied and a plan to scale back security is made. Ambassador Stevens responds with a cable to Secretary Clinton requesting additional security resources. And you, sir, on May the 3rd, terminated effective immediately the U.S. mission to Libya use of a DC-3 to provide logistical support to Special Forces units assigned to Benghazi. We don't know what could have been done with that on that fateful day. Ambassador Stevens responds saying, please don't scale these assets back. And he says again in July, the overall security conditions continue to be unpredictable with large numbers of armed groups and individuals not under the control of the central government. You, sir, formally denied that request. Finally, August 16th, a classified cable after an emergency meeting with the ambassador, an extraordinary, not ordinary event, another request for additional security, saying the embassy could not withstand a coordinated attack. This final cry was not answered. Did you receive that cable, the August 16th cable, sir?
Yes, sir, I did. And if I might call this,
I have limited
cable,
time. Did you respond in the affirmative, or did you decline that request?
This cable, we did not decline the request.
Was additional security provided on that day, weeks before the September 11th attack?
The cable, sir, and I have a copy in front of me, it closes with U.S. Mission Benghazi will submit request to U.S. Embassy Tripoli for additional security upgrades and staffing needs. We never received that additional request. So there was no way I could respond to a request that had not yet been submitted.
Do you know if Secretary Clinton saw this cable?
I do not believe so.
Let me ask you something about a security waiver on September the 11th. Security at the consulate was deemed high on the State Department's threat list, but yet it didn't meet the minimum security standards as required by the Congress under the Secure Embassies Construction and Counterterrorism Act. Somebody at the State Department waived these standards known as the Inman standards for our presence in Benghazi. Do you know who waived those standards?
It wasn't the Inman standards, sir. The Inman standards only apply to buildings that we build. What I believe we are talking about here, sir, is what are called the OSPB standards, the Overseas Security Policy Board standards. These are the standards that we were using in Benghazi. But since we had to move in Benghazi and we did not have time either to build a new building or to take the months that it takes to retrofit, we took the Overseas Security Board standards as our goal. And as I mentioned in response to Mr. Conley, we were running down those standards, adding additional items every
Well, I have a memo that was sent to you from your staff saying that we needed to bring the facility up to an acceptable standard to you, Mr. Ambassador. I don't know what the action was. Apparently, it was not approved. I'd like to enter this memo, Mr. Chairman, into the record.
Without objection.
Finally, I got limited time. I've talked to sources on the ground that fateful day when the Marines were deployed from Rota, Spain, into Tripoli, and were asked to deplane and change into civilian clothing, and that mission was delayed by several hours. Now, first of all, why wasn't this plane with Marines that could respond possibly in a timely manner sent to Benghazi? Why wasn't that done? And then secondly, since it was sent to Tripoli, why was it delayed by hours so that they could deplane and change into civilian clothing?
First of all, by the time the Marines were mustered and that plane was en route, we had already evacuated our personnel and we had closed our facility in Benghazi. So there was no purpose of them going to Benghazi because there were no Americans left there.
So if the plane had gone straight from Rota to Benghazi in the 8-hour span of the attack, you're saying to me that they could not have responded in a timely manner?
Because the plane, sir, was moving to Benghazi, moving to Tripoli on the 12th, not on the night of the 11th.
Let me conclude that I think some more people higher up should be held accountable for what happened that day.
We're going to go now to Mr. Joseph Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your service and for testifying today. If you needed a second to respond or to finish the question, I'll give you that time. And
if I could just add one thing two things to what Mr. McCall asked. First of all, on the DC-3, the DC-3, sir, was not there in support of the Special Forces Detachment. When we opened first in Benghazi and then later relocated to Tripoli, there was no commercial air service available at all into Libya. No commercial air service. So we pulled an aircraft from Afghanistan, and it was running shuttles into Iraq. It was never based there. It was based first in Malta. It was based in Malta at that point. When commercial air service was established, there was no longer a need for that aircraft. So it had nothing to do with support of the Special Forces, except when they came into Benghazi and into Tripoli the first time, they flew that plane in. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And again, thank you for your service. I want to just begin by recognizing the memory of 4 brave Americans who did give their lives in service to our country that day, and say that I think the best thing that we can do is obviously ask some very tough questions about what happened, why it happened, and what we can do to try to move forward. In that vein, if there are reforms that need to be made to our embassies or our foreign policy and to the ARB process, we should make them. But the focus should be on lessons learned and moving forward, not focusing on perceived imperfections with and assigning political blame for the highlights of the day. And to that end, Mr. Ambassador, I was wondering if you might be able to enlighten me. I believe the ARB process began in 1986 after legislation was passed. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
And, sir, do you know how many ARBs have been convened since then?
The count is either 18 or 19, depending on whether you count the Dar es Salaam and Nairobi as either 2 or 1.
And, sir, if we're going with that 18 figure, how many of those were under Republican presidents?
I will
figure
have
13 sound okay?
I will accept that figure, sir.
2 under Ronald Reagan, Honduras and Greece, 3 under the first President Bush, Philippines, Bolivia, and Peru, 8 under the second President Bush, Jordan, Gaza, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Pakistan, Sudan.
That sounds correct, sir.
And, sir, do you have any idea during the course of this time of any major reform efforts that were done, initiated by Congress, of the ARB process?
No, sir.
Okay. So now, sir, if I can, turning to the witnesses, there's been a number of questions today about which witnesses were and weren't called. Did you have any influence over which witnesses were called to testify over the ARB process?
No, sir. Once the ARB started, my only contact was to be a witness.
Did Secretary Clinton have any influence over who was called to testify before that process?
No, sir.
Did the administration attempt to influence that process in any way?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, moving forward, you had mentioned, and it's been referenced several times today, 29 different recommendations that the ARB found and recommended to State Department to try to implement, and you've broken that down to, I believe it was 64 different action steps, which, given that the focus, I believe, should be going forward, what can be done to protect our diplomats as we are asking them to represent the United States in continually volatile areas of the world. What are the highlights? Where should we be focused? Should Congress be focused, excuse me? If it is financially, well, where should those resources be directed? If it's through policy, what are those policies? If you can do that in a minute.
I think the 2 most important things are the ARB's recommendation that there be a capability of funding to construct new embassies of the character and the quality of, say, a Tunis or a Khartoum, Sudan, which were able to withstand attacks until either our own military forces can arrive or until host nation forces muster and do that. And the secondly is the issue about additional local guard capabilities.
Mr. Ambassador, is there a way, I see in your testimony that you indicated that such an embassy could take up to 4 years to site, plan, construct, and finish. Is there ways that we can speed that process up? Is that delayed because of bureaucracy? Is it delayed? Trying to spend 4 years to build an embassy seems like a long time.
That, sir, is the entire, from finding the land, and you have to buy land overseas for this, through a complex process. An embassy is not just like any old office building, as you can imagine, because of the security, both technical and physical, we built into the physical plan, and that simply takes longer, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In its report of the attack, the Accountability Review Board found that there was, quote, unsatisfactory leadership performance, systematic failures in leadership, and management deficiencies at senior levels. It would seem to me, in the normal world, which would be outside of government, if somebody reviewed a business or an entity and found that there were deficiencies and lack of leadership and lack of accountability, somebody would face the consequences. They would see the music. But not so with the government, especially the State Department. 4 junior employees were placed on leave in December for their actions and their judgments related to Benghazi, but Secretary Kerry, when he came in, he said, oh, it's okay, come on back. In fact, Elizabeth Dibble has been promoted to Deputy Chief of Mission in London. No one has been held accountable for, as I have quoted the Accountability Review Board, unsatisfactory leadership performance. And in this case, it's not just like missing a memo. People have died. I know there are those in the administration who says that was a long time ago, but to those 4 families, it was the death of 4 individuals. And when you mess up in leadership like this and people die, it would seem to me somebody has to be, if we can use the word, punished for that. But no one has been punished at all in this situation. And then you look on the other side. To quote the President, here's what he said: my biggest priority now is bringing these folks to justice. Okay, that's what he said a year ago. My biggest priority now is bringing these folks to justice. It would seem to me that the President should be just as concerned about Americans dying in Libya as he is about Syrians dying in Syria. That seems to be the priority now, not bringing these folks to justice, because they haven't been brought to justice. My background as a prosecutor and a judge, and I've seen a lot of cases made by a lot of law enforcement, and you're here and you've told us, I can't tell you what the FBI, the DOD, and all of our intelligence agencies are doing to capture the bad guys because I assume it's classified. Well, after a year, we can't find these people, but yet a CNN reporter can go to Benghazi at a hotel, at a coffee shop, and have coffee with the suspected ringleader of this, who's been indicted by our government. Maybe the FBI ought to just ask the CNN reporter, how did you get a hold of this guy? You know, why don't we bring him back? And it's skeptical. I am skeptical. People I represent are skeptical about the administration, the State Department, the FBI not bringing these killers to justice. My question to you, do you believe Ansar al-Sharia was responsible for the attack on the Benghazi mission?
I think that is one of the questions that is still being sorted out. It's possible that it was. It's possible that it was them and others. That is being sorted out.
Do you think they were involved? I mean, you're the guy that should know. Do you think they were involved or not?
I know that this was a terrorist attack, and it doesn't matter to me whether it was Ansar al-Sharia or Al-Qaeda or whoever. These were terrorists. And whatever organization they belong to, they are enemies of the United States, and they must be brought to justice.
Do you think Ansar al-Sharia should be named as foreign terrorist organization?
That's not in my domain, but I'll take the question back to my colleagues.
Well, it would seem like you'd want to know what group was involved, and it doesn't make any difference to you, but you do believe it was terrorists that were involved in this murder.
I didn't say I don't care of who is involved. I'm saying that there were clearly a range of individuals who attacked our facility that night, and they were terrorists.
And you'll get back with me on whether you think the Ansar al-Sharia should be a...
I'll be glad to take that question.
You are aware, of course, on September the 12th, our time, they claimed responsibility for this the next day, the next morning they claimed.
And then someone else claiming to be Ansar al-Sharia withdrew that claim.
But at the end of the day, here we are. Nobody has been taken out. Nobody's in custody. Nobody's in jail. Either on the side of the State Department, nobody's in jail accountable for the murder. So whether it's the people who were responsible for the killing or the people who may have made mistakes about the administration of this, nobody's in custody. Last question. Have people in the, may I ask the question, Mr. Chairman?
Well, I'm afraid your time has expired, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to the previous question?
Well, I'm going to suggest that we go now to Lois Frankel. And Mr. Poe, if you want to pass your question down to one of the other members on the committee, I'm sure they can ask it. And Ms. Frankel, if you want to allow the ambassador to respond, I'm sure you can do it. But we're going to stick to the clock, and we go now to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your very gracious way of handling these meetings. Mr. Kennedy, Ambassador, thank you for your service, and please, if you want to answer.
I just, in response to the last question, Congressman, I believe that individuals of the State Department were held responsible. Being a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State or an Assistant Secretary of State is not I humbly submit, sir, being a junior employee. Those are senior positions in the State Department. And have one of those individuals resign as the Assistant Secretary and then all of them be relieved of their responsibilities is a serious act of accountability to be relieved at that levels. And secondly, Benghazi has taken, even since the events of 9/11, has taken a serious turn for the worse. Yes, they will let journalists in, but they are not letting U.S. law enforcement in to arrest people there because the government of Libya is not in control to that degree.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I want to just start by saying I know everybody here shares the grief of the families who lost their loved ones in this tragedy, and I think we all recognize that it is, in a large part, the work that our diplomats do that plays a role in securing the freedoms that we enjoy, including this discussion, which I, with a great respect and fondness for my colleagues, I don't concur in some of the tone. With that said, I want to thank Mr. Joe Wilson and Mr. Dana Roback, and of course our chair, that allowed me to visit. With Mr. Roback, we visited NATO, and I went with Mr. Wilson to AFRICOM. And I want to say that we did have discussions with the highest military commanders about Benghazi, and they were all unanimous in saying that there was no military action that they thought could have saved the day once attack began, which I think is what you did state to us. We keep hearing that no one is being held accountable, but I do want to make, you to clarify one particular point, which is, did the ARB did they conclude that no individual had breached their duty? Was that a finding?
That is correct, Congressman. The ARB said that two individuals had not carried out their responsibilities in the way they could, but they did not find a breach of duty. And what Secretary Kerry's decision was to validate the ARB's decision, but actually go farther than the ARB's decision and relieve all four of their senior level positions.
And I don't want anyone to forget, and I think we all understand that the responsibility, the sole responsibility, as ARB said, for this attack was on terrorists. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you told Mr. Grayson that Mr. Stevens could move freely about in Benghazi in order to do he was moving freely about in order to do his job.
Yes, he was authorized as an ambassador to go to any location in his country of assignment without Washington approval.
And of course, an attack could have taken place
Every millisecond.
out in the field.
That is correct, and there is an inherent danger to being a United States representative.
So my final question to you is just, what have we learned from this that helps us assess when the conditions are just too dangerous for a diplomat to remain?
Our position is, and this is something that we are constantly enhancing, is every day we review the threat levels at all posts in the world, not only the highest threat posts. And if we reach a point where we believe that the mitigation tools that are available to us cannot lower that threat level down, then we close the post. If I might offer you one example. We were in Damascus, Syria, continuing to operate there several years ago. We kept monitoring the situation, and one morning my diplomatic security colleagues and I concluded that given the situation on the ground in Damascus, we could no longer mitigate the risk sufficiently. I went to see the Secretary of State, and she instantaneously gave me approval to suspend operations in Damascus and pull out our people. That, if there is intelligence or any other information available to us that our mitigation strategies are no longer valid, then we suspend operations and remove our people.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we're going to Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina at this time.
I yield some time to the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman. One question, Mr. Ambassador. Has any State Department employees ever been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements after the Benghazi attack?
Not that I'm aware of, sir, no.
So you don't know whether they have or they have?
The State Department does not use non-disclosure agreements.
So that's a foreign concept to you, non-disclosure agreements with the State Department?
Well, obviously, we do sign agreements not to disclose classified information to individuals who do not have classified access, but that's different, I believe, than the thrust of your question. You're asking me, did we put into place specific non-disclosure agreements after Benghazi, and I do not believe we did so, sir. No.
Classified or non-classified?
No. No, sir.
I'll yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for an excellent line of questioning and points made about Americans being dismayed that no one's been brought to justice in Benghazi, the perpetrators, nor has anyone been brought to disciplinary action other than a slap on the hand within the Department of State. That needs to happen. Just being removed and reassigned to another position is not justifiable. People need to lose their jobs over the failures that were admitted to here today, were pointed out in the ARB report, and I want to thank the gentleman for mentioning and acknowledging that it was a terrorist attack. That's more than the former Secretary of State was willing to do sitting in that very chair, Mr. Undersecretary. A lot of questions remain about Benghazi, questions that won't be answered today, but questions that need to be asked. What was Ambassador Stevens doing in Benghazi on 11 September? Did he have a dinner or a meeting with the Turkish officials? What was the substance of those meetings? Was it funneling arms from the Libyan rebels to the Syrian fighters through Turkey? A great impact on regional security has been the proliferation of shoulder-fired missiles or man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, leaking out of Libya since weapon depots were heavily looted during Libya fighting. Out of Libya's 20,000 man-pads inventory, how many are accounted for today? How many had been recovered under that mission going on in Benghazi? And how many were stored in Benghazi that ultimately fell in the hands of the Libyan rebels and possibly al-Qaeda? Can you answer that question?
I'll have to get you that information for the record, sir. I don't have that with me.
Okay. The question that I have is who knew what and when? You're familiar with the term Neuwan, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay. For the committee, that is a secure telephone conference call system between major Washington National Security Watch Centers. It's used for rapid evaluation of a breaking crisis. Was there a Neuwan initiated by the State Department on or prior to 11 September 12?
I believe there was. I know there were massive interagency telephone calls going on. I can check that. But I know that I was on numerous calls with officials from other U.S. government agencies.
I appreciate that. I'm specifically talking about a Neuwan. So I'm going to make a formal request to you and the State Department today for the activity logs of the Department of State, its Ops Center, and its Bureau of Intel and Research for any Neuwan activity prior to and during the 9/11/2012 timeframe for Libya and specifically Benghazi. I want to know who was on the call and what the substance of the call was. And we'll put that in writing to you as well. There's so many questions that need to be asked and answered about the disciplinary action at the Department of State. Is it true that you required a daily report of the personnel in country and that you personally approved every official American who went to Tripoli or Benghazi, either on official business or assignment or a TDY?
I set a cap. I set a cap for the number of personnel who were to be in Benghazi, and we controlled because it was It was a post with.
But did you require a daily report on all the personnel in country?
I don't believe I got a daily report. I never remember getting a daily report on everyone on country. I would get questions from time to time about adding or subtracting personnel.
Just a limited time. Gregory Hicks, former Deputy Chief of Mission at Embassy Tripoli, noted that in his testimony before. So my question is, do you require that for every country, or was this an obsession with Libya at that point in time?
It's certain posts which are either under evacuation or ordered departure status. We keep track down to the single number.
And I can see the merit there. So I'm out of time. You will follow my request on Neuwine.
Absolutely. And as you say, you have other questions, I'd be glad to come see you or any other member of the committee individually and engage in a fuller discussion.
We appreciate that, and we also would appreciate those documents because we don't know what legal standing you have not to turn them over to us. Thank you, Ambassador. Now we're going to go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are three regrettable things with regard to Libya. First and most regrettable, we lost Ambassador Stevens and three others. We were in Benghazi at a time when it turned out not to be safe to be there on that day. Second, there was what I call talk show error as to the reason that the attack took place. And then third, we haven't been able to bring the culprits to justice. The gentleman from Texas points out that, well, the CNN was able to talk to some terrorists in Libya, so why can't we? I'll point out very often terrorists make themselves available in clandestine meetings with American journalists. Daniel Pearl was in just such a situation. It turned out the terrorists killed him. But terrorists may allow themselves to come into contact with journalists while hiding from our military. Has the Libyan government authorized us to take kinetic action against terrorists in Benghazi if we believe that they are responsible for the death of Ambassador Stevens?
We are working very, very closely with the government of Libya.
Can you give me a yes or a no?
Let me take that question for the record, sir.
I'd sure like to know the answer. Take for the record usually means never get an answer. Because I'll point out that we were holding over $25 billion of Libyan assets. I and others urge that that money be held on to, at least to cover our costs. Had we done so, we might have a little bit of leverage with Libya. Right now, all we have is the gratitude of the Libyan government, which wouldn't exist without us. That gratitude seems to be insufficient for you to be able to give me a positive answer. These are murderers of Ambassador Stevens, and you can't tell me whether we have the right to bring them to justice should we be able to locate them and determine who's guilty. Now, as to the talk show error, I'll simply point out that at my town halls, if you had to ask anybody which State Department person is responsible for stating on talk shows, or for the fact that it was stated on talk shows that this was caused by a bad movie or YouTube video, they would say, well, I turned on the TV, I saw Susan Rice, it turned out she was not, the statements she was making were not accurate. I don't think there's anybody who observes Washington politics who doesn't think Susan Rice has paid a price for the fact that those were the talking points she was given. And all of us who have to rely on others for the talking points we have know that it's our face that's there, and if I make mistakes based on my staff, it's the voters who will not allow me to have an office. I think Susan Rice has paid a price. Now let's talk about the most critical decision, and that was the decision to have Ambassador Stevens there. I think as I understand it, Ambassador Stevens was not just the authorized ambassador. He was probably in the State Department the person most knowledgeable about Libya. Is that generally correct?
I think so, sir. He had served before as the deputy chief.
So if we had to have one person in the State Department decide whether to take the risk, Ambassador Stevens was equipped to do so. He was a hero. He knew the risk that he was taking. Now, all of us, every time a soldier goes to try to take a hill, they don't know whether it's a 1% risk or a 99% risk, but they know it's a significant risk of their life. Ambassador Stevens knew he was risking his life. He was a hero in that he put his job first, And now we come back and say, well, with hindsight, it turns out to be a bigger risk than the ambassador should have taken. Was there any pressure on Ambassador Stevens to go to Benghazi, or to go to Benghazi knowing the number of security personnel that he would be taking with him?
No, sir. We put no pressure on Ambassador Stevens to go or not.
So he knew where he was going. He understood. It's very hard to understand Libya, but he understood it as well as anybody in our government. He understood the number of security personnel that were already there. He understood the number of CIA personnel that were already there. He understood the number of security people he was taking with him. He understood Libya as well as possible. He decided to risk his life in the service of his country. And then we're told nobody paid a price for the decision to take that risk. I think Ambassador Stevens paid a price for his heroism. And it's very hard for me to say that there was anybody outside Libya who made the decision or should have been making the decision as to whether Ambassador Stevens went to Benghazi that day. Do you have a comment on that?
No, it is the job of an American ambassador to go into harm's way. We try every day to mitigate that risk to the maximum extent possible, but it is inherently dangerous, as you say, sir.
Thank you.
We'll go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. I appreciate your service to your country. I also thank, soldiers all around the globe for their service to their country, and especially for those that were involved in this incident. And one of the things soldiers and airmen like I am are always taught is that your country will always be there. As I've said earlier, that your country will move heaven and earth to ensure that you'll be protected, to ensure that if you find yourself under attack, they'll come and get you. I heard a colleague earlier mention that, we need answers. This isn't about exploiting this for political gain, somehow implying that, our side of the aisle is just interested in embarrassing the administration and just gaining in politics here. I take a huge exception to that, and I have to get this on the record, because when 4 Americans die, and I see that there was 7 hours between a first and a second attack, and I know that there were military assets nearby that within 7 hours could have responded, and I hear the Department of Defense even come out and say, well, we never could have made it by the 7th hour, but they had no idea that attack was coming, and hopefully they didn't know that second attack was coming, or there'd be a whole line of questions about why there weren't assets in place in the first place. But when I hear that, it really bothers me, because my belief as an airman, as a pilot myself, and as just a member of the military, is that when people die and when there's not a serious military response, I would hope that if I was in that situation, the House Foreign Affairs committees would keep having hearings for a year or two until they found out what really happened. So I think that's important. You also mentioned earlier, too, that it doesn't really matter. I don't know what you meant, but you said it really doesn't matter who did it, just that it was done, it was terrorism. I think it does matter. I think we need answers on that, because ultimately it gives us a blueprint on who we need to kill or capture, which I think is very important, and I hope that that's done. I had another colleague earlier that asked you if there was any force nearby that could have responded between the beginning of the attack and by the time Ambassador Stevens was killed, and you said no, and that's probably true. There was about a 90-minute lag. Again, there were 3 other Americans that died, some of the 7 hours later. You also mentioned that the nearest military assets were in Djibouti. I've been to Djibouti as a congressman. It's a important base, and I appreciate that. Are you familiar with Aviano Air Base, sir?
I am, sir. And if I said the reason I cited Djibouti is that is what the Defense Department has told me. So that is not, I am
Okay,
quoting,
so it's the defense. I got it. I'm sure they're aware of Aviano as well.
Yes, sir.
But it's 1,049 miles away from Benghazi, direct flight. And those are F-16s, by the way. They can kind of haul. Dallas to Washington, which you mentioned, I think is 1,330 miles away. So actually Aviano is closer, and there's something we can do called a show of force, in which a plane comes in, flies very low, and scatters an enemy. And I've always wondered why in 8 hours we couldn't have made that happen. Now, the question on the SST, you made the decision to terminate the SST, I believe, and that was as of August 2012. Now, you testified today, I believe, that there was a replacement to the SST, correct? So that was not a loss of capacity.
That is correct. The State Department replaced the capacities and 6 of the billets that were part of the 16 remained in country.
And they were based out of Tripoli.
They were based in Tripoli.
Ultimately responded to Benghazi. Was there movement during the attacks from the replacement team to Benghazi?
That is, yes, sir, they did.
And how did they get there? Did they charter an aircraft?
Charter an aircraft.
Didn't we have a DC-3 that they could have hopped on?
No, the DC-3 was no longer there, but the DC-3 was never based in Tripoli. The DC-3 was based in Malta, and so when we would have had, it was I think.
But our prior SST would have utilized that DC-3,
No, sir.
correct? Who
No.
would have? Who's flying that? Not who's flying it, but what are we using it for?
The DC-3, in effect, ran a shuttle between the commercial airport in Malta and Tripoli before there was any commercial airline service established.
So
once commercial airline service was established, U.S. government personnel moved between.
Thank you. So we had to charter an aircraft to get that replacement team into Benghazi. Now, how long did that take? Do you know?
I can look at the.
Okay, it took X amount of time, but they were able to respond in time, and or they were able to respond. No, definitely not. Probably in time.
Faster.
It's interesting that chartering an aircraft can actually be done faster than the military can have an aircraft on alert and respond to Benghazi in a short amount of time with F-16 power. So I thought that was interesting. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Randy Weber of Texas.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world.
You remember that, Mr. Ambassador?
I don't ever remember hearing the commercial, but I am well aware of it, sir. Yes, sir.
Who didn't answer that call that night?
I believe that the call was answered, sir.
Who didn't keep Mary Stevens, that's Chris Stevens' mother's son, safe? Are you convinced that we've gotten to the bottom of who's accountable?
Yes, sir, I am.
Are you prepared, would you like the task of going to Mary Stevens and explaining to her that 4 people getting reassigned is paying a price?
Sir, they were not reassigned. They were relieved of their senior level positions. That is a serious disciplinary action.
You said in your remarks that you presented to us on page 6 that under the Vienna Convention of 1961, I'm quoting you now, we do our part, and you kind of intimated where necessary sending Marine security guards. Who didn't send Marine security guards into Benghazi?
We have, at that point, we in the Department of Defense had only enough personnel to deploy 152 Marine security guard detachments, and we had 285 posts.
Do you think that that's an acceptable explanation to Ms. Mary Stevens?
It is the facts, sir, and it is also part of your helping us get the additional funding that is allowing us to increase.
You answered the question. On page 9, you also said regarding the ARB recommendations, and I'm quoting you, the department has created a deputy assistant secretary for high threat posts, end quote. And then you intimate who undoubtedly will send Marines. Well, if you've created, if the ARB has asked for a new post, whose responsibility was that before Benghazi happened? If we've created a post just to do that, whose responsibility was that? And then you went on to say that you believed it was everybody's responsibility. Security was everyone's responsibility.
That is correct, sir.
Okay. So in the report, you agreed with the fact that there are those who were held, you say they were held accountable. I call it reassignment. I don't recall your question. Was anybody denied pay or benefits of those 4?
They were, what the Secretary of State was carrying out is a review, and under the American system of fairness, we do not, in effect, find someone guilty until the review is complete.
You said, actually, I'm quoting from you earlier, you said that's an essential element of American fairness, end quote. That's what you said sitting in that chair. But let me tell you this. The American public expects that an essential element of fairness
is that we get to the bottom of this and someone is held accountable. You said that the ARB report, and I know they said this, and I'm quoting what you said here today, is that no one had a breach of duty.
That is what the ARB found, sir. That is what the statute.
Yet you just sat there and retestified that security was everyone's responsibility. What's the difference between responsibility and duty?
I don't see a difference.
So there was a breach of duty then?
No, sir.
There was not a breach of duty in your opinion? And you would be okay explaining that to Mary Stevens?
I believe, sir, that there was no breach of duty. The ARB found that, and I concur to the extent.
I'm almost done here, Mr. Chairman. I would submit to you, Ambassador, that it is Congress's duty, your duty, to get to the bottom of this and someone is held accountable. And if we don't do that, then we, in essence, have had a breach of duty. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We go now to Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for being here. You're in an important position. I'm sure you're busy. You are the Secretary for Management, correct? Secretary for Management. Undersecretary.
Undersecretary for Management,
Yes,
sir.
thank you for correction. Would you help a friend if a friend were in trouble?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I just want to point out for the record that that the Secretary had a hand in appointing 4 of the members of the ARB, and according to your previous testimony and answers to the Chairman, that you made recommendations regarding those positions or those potential appointees. No question regarding that. Do you read your emails when a crisis situation is occurring?
I read every email before I go home in the evening, sir.
All right, thank you. Should the State Department, accepting issues of national security or operational security or classified information, be generally transparent? Should the Department of State be generally transparent, accepting those issues?
Absolutely.
All right, and should Foreign Service or military service members have an expectation that the U.S. government is going to do everything it can to ensure their personal safety?
Absolutely.
So when did you know, based on solid intelligence, that the rhetoric your agency and the administration was telling the American people and the world was incorrect? When did you know that?
After the television talk shows.
Well, they went on for weeks, so can you be specific?
The information that Ambassador Royce used on those television talk shows was based on information provided.
Okay, so you're not going to be specific. I'm holding up, and I'm sure you won't recognize this. First of all, you're far away, with all due respect. But second of all, this is a transcribed copy of an email in which you are included, and it is as of 12:46, so 1:45 on the 12th. So a day later, in which Ansar al-Sharia is noted by Assistant Secretary Beth Jones. So at that point, if you're, per your testimony, you knew by that afternoon, since you read your emails at the end of each day to be sure, that you knew at that point. What did you do?
If I might, sir, Ansar al-Sharia, later a spokesperson from Ansar al-Sharia said they were responsible.
I understand that, but at that moment, that's later, but at that moment, you knew.
The next day they withdrew.
But at that moment, you knew. What did you do? What did you do? You're a manager. What did you personally do to set the ship straight on the talking points and the message that were going out to the American people and the world? What did you do?
I knew at that point that Ansar al-Sharia's spokesman had withdrawn that claim, and I am, as you said rightly, sir, I am a management officer at the State Department. When you get to complex issues like responsibility
when the government of the country understands and recognizes it was a terrorist attack, and you already said in this committee hearing and this chair, in this hour, that you recognize it's a terrorist attack, and you don't do anything to change it.
The collectivity of the intelligence community concluded that what they concluded, and
that it's a terrorist attack, and for 3 weeks, your administration, your department, put out to the American people that it was not. It was a spontaneous eruption of a demonstration. Let me move on. Why must, you're a manager, again, you're a manager, so you can get things done, you're at a high level. Why must this committee transcribe? This is an email to you. It's not an email form. Why must we transcribe all the information that we get? Why can't we get it and get copies of it? We'll make the copies of it. Why can't we? Why must we subpoena it? Why aren't you forthcoming? You personally.
The chairman has already.
I'm asking you.
The chairman has already posed that question, and I've taken the question.
And what was your answer? What are you doing about it?
I'm taking the question back to the State Department, sir.
But you're in a position of managing. What are you going to do? Instead of taking the question, what are you going to do to answer it right now?
I'm telling you, sir, that I'm taking the question.
Listen, I don't want to point fingers, and it's been alleged here. I'm not here to point fingers, but I think it's abundantly clear after a year to the American people what's happening here. This administration and your department in particular are stonewalling. They don't want to give up the information. They have been doing that since this began. They actively misled at the time and continue to mislead now regarding the facts. We just want the fact. It's apparent that the information that came out regarding the talking points did not comport with the president's narrative, did not comport with the president's narrative in election time, with a president election looming, and so they had to be changed. That is apparent. It is also apparent that the administration continues to hide this fact from the American people. And with regard to Foreign Service officers, it's apparent that if that happens again, and it does not fit with the president's narrative, they will be left to be killed, sodomized, and have their bloody bodies dragged through the streets for all the world to see, instead of having this administration find out what really happened. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Yes.
Sir, I have been a Foreign Service officer for 40 years. We do everything we can, as I've outlined here, to attempt to mitigate the risk to our personnel overseas. But being a diplomat is an inherently risky activity. I cannot, nor can any of my colleagues, nor can I believe that anyone can end that risk. We do everything we can to mitigate that risk, but we cannot end the risk.
We're going to Mr. Trey Radel from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you tell me about we know that the 4 people are relieved of their senior positions. They essentially get reassigned somewhere else. Can you tell me what you got Ray, Eric, Scott, Charlene, who are the 4 here. What are they doing today?
One of them has been reassigned to a lower level position in the Bureau of African Affairs. One is the director of the Office of Foreign Missions, and the other 2 are in the process of being reassigned to positions of lesser responsibility with no worldwide purview.
So these undoubtedly, unquestionably, are not higher seniority levels, but correct?
They are been reassigned to positions of lesser responsibility. Yes, sir.
Lesser responsibility. Okay.
And it's
quickly with Mr. Raymond Maxwell. Why? I don't understand why he gets put on administrative leave when his duties do not include any review, approval, or even formations of recommendations regarding security resources in Libya. Why is this? How does this guy fit in?
Mr. Maxwell was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, responsible for the Maghreb, meaning the band of countries across the North African littoral, including Libya. That Libya was within his purview as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Maghreb.
So I think you'd agree with me that, look, all of us here, regardless of what side of the aisle we're on, we know that it's important to learn from our mistakes. Part of the improvements that we in this committee have done, we passed some legislation. I worked with Congresswoman Frankel on the Protecting Americans Abroad Act, which allows state to hire the best of the best when it comes to security, not the cheapest. We're proud of that. We have a bipartisan committee here, and this is not political what we're doing here. We know that it's important to learn from mistakes, but we also need accountability, which is why we're here today. We need to show the American people who we are beholden to, tax-paying Americans, that we are responsible. But it also sends a message that being inept will not be tolerated, and this will never, ever happen again. People are dead. There are 4 men who are dead. The young girls will never walk down their aisle with their father at their wedding. Young boys will never be able to toss a football with their dad. And the people who are responsible for this have been relieved of their senior positions. You had said it earlier, reassignment equals accountability. It does not equal accountability. Reassignment does not equal accountability. They're reassigned, they're being put into another position where they've never missed a paycheck, where they're going to have their cushy government job, and they're still going to get a pension. In the real world, this would never happen. This would never, ever happen. They would be fired. They would be terminated because they failed. And 4 people, including an ambassador, are dead. This is unacceptable. I hope that in a bipartisan fashion, we can, in some way, shape, or form, actually have someone be held accountable. And that not only within our own government, but let's pray that we find the people that are responsible for this attack, because everyone has blood on their hands. It is unacceptable. Reassignment does not equal accountability. Mr. Chair, I yield the rest of my time. My question was answered.
We go now to Mr. Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Kennedy, thank you for being here. I agree with the congressmen on my left, or to the left over here, Ingalls, Meeks, and Connolly, that we should focus on making our embassy and personnel safer around the world. However, in order to do that, we must look at our failures of the past so we do not make those same mistakes again. And I want to kind of reference a report here. Deputy Chief of Missions for Embassy Tripoli, Gregory Hicks, stated that Secretary Clinton wanted Benghazi converted to a permanent constituent post. Ambassador Pickering, when he was asked by the ARB and when this was discussed, he kind of looked surprised, looked both ways. Does the 7th floor know about this? And it brought up questioning that they should look at this through the ARB, which stands for Accountability Review Board. In addition, looking back at the past, the 1999 ARB report states that the issued response to the bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and Tanzania. This report urged that the Secretary of State should take a personal and active role in carrying out the responsibility of ensuring the security of U.S. diplomatic personnel abroad. And the board should have questioned the extent to which the Secretary fulfilled or did not fulfill this mandate. And again, with Ambassador Stevens making multiple requests for security and being denied in lieu of this report that looks in the past so that we don't make those same reports again, would you agree that we should have probably questioned higher up in the chain of command? And I'm going to do you a favor. My questions are going to be pretty much yes or no.
Your first question about permanent posts in Benghazi, the Secretary of State never said to me, establish a permanent post in Benghazi, and I would have been the person who would have launched
Mr. Chairman, I've got this report here. I'll submit it for questioning. Let me ask you this. Okay, go ahead, the second one.
Your second one, the Secretary of State does take her responsibilities very, very seriously. As I mentioned earlier, when I went to the Secretary of State and said the situation in Damascus, Syria, had reached the point where we could no longer mitigate the risk, the Secretary instantaneously replied, take the people out. We had no actionable intelligence, as the Director of National Intelligence had said, about this threat in Benghazi, and therefore I never went to the Secretary of State and told her it was time to leave Benghazi.
All right, let me ask you this. I'm going to cut you off. Do you think that the ARB should have questioned higher up is the question, yes or no?
That's the judgment for the ARB, sir.
All right. Who do you report to directly?
I report to the Secretary of State.
All right, so is it fair to say that you are accountable to the Secretary? You said yes. As the Undersecretary for Management, you're responsible for the people, resources, budget, facilities, technology, financial, operations, consular affairs, logistics, contracting, and security for the Department of State operations, and is the Secretary's principal advisor on management issues. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. The people under you report directly to you, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. You oversee their day-to-day operations.
Yes, sir.
They are accountable to you, and you said that's correct. If they fill in their job description and it affects your department, say mission objective, would that ultimately be your responsibility? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
All right. Would it be a sign of lack of management?
Not necessarily.
Would it be a lack of failure of your job and responsibility?
Not necessarily.
Since you stated that you report directly to the Secretary, and if you fail at your job due to your subordinates, you're saying it's not necessarily your superior's fault either.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Correct.
For the record, Ms. Clinton was the Secretary of State at the time. We all know that. The reports I have, and when I was president with this committee, and we interviewed Ms. Clinton, she stated that she requested personally for Ambassador Stevens to come to this post, to take this assignment. Are you aware of that?
Yes, sir. I'm the one who set up the appointment between Chris and the Secretary.
The reports I have said that the embassy in Benghazi was understaffed and underprotected by the standards at the time. Is that correct?
That is the ARB's conclusion.
All right. I also, the reports I read said that Ambassador Stevens said there were increased tensions between the personnel and local Benghazi population. That's correct, isn't it?
That was what Chris reported. But there were no threats against the U.S. temporary mission facility or against our personnel.
Reports also stated that Ambassador Stevens had requested increased security on more than one occasion, correct?
That is correct.
Reports said that the request for increased security was turned down each time, and we know that's correct. Who turned those down? Do you know?
I have reviewed the situation, and every request, as I've testified before, every request that was made for improvements were okayed and funded, with the exception of the 4 guard towers, which I mentioned earlier.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Kennedy, this gets down to 2 things. One is accountability, and the second is trust. And we must have the accountability before we can restore the trust of the American people in terms of what happened in Benghazi or what may happen in the future. So I'd like to refocus our attention on these 4 people that you say they've lost their titles. But let me be clear, they have not lost any money or any benefits, yes or no?
No.
Okay, so they've gotten paid. They got an 8-month paid leave while the State Department has done their investigation, yes or no?
Correct.
All right, so they've been off for 8 months. I also serve on the Government Reform Committee, and I know that we've made a number of requests that have gone unanswered, really. Were there any adverse, other than title changes and post changes, were there any adverse personnel actions that were taken against these 4 people that, according to the ARB, were systemically involved in mismanagement?
That's not, the ARB actually, sir, talked about 2 people
Okay, but those 2
and
people
2 others.
being part of the 4, but the 2 people, did any adverse actions happen to those 2 people, other than title changes?
Sir, if I...
Yes or no?
A title change
I understand, in your opinion, a title change is a big deal, but we're talking about people, 4 dead Americans, so let's look at it. Anything other than that?
Being removed as a Deputy Assistant Secretary is a major act.
All right, well, so let me go on. You mentioned the consideration of other posts, and you mentioned 2 people. It's troubling for me to start to hear reports of where these 2 people are being considered for very high-profile, secure posts overseas, and knowing that the State Department takes about 12 months to go through that, it means that that review process had to have started while they were on administrative leave. Are you aware of that?
You're correct, sir, that the process we assign in the summer.
So are you aware that they're
summer,
being considered for high-profile, secure positions overseas? Yes or no? Are you aware?
I am unaware. They have not been assigned anywhere.
I understand they haven't been assigned. You're avoiding my question. No, are you aware that they're being considered for high-profile, secure positions overseas?
I guess the answer is no. I mean, obviously...
It's either a yes or a no. Are you aware?
Obviously, sir, while this is pending, one has to look at the 2...
But you're in charge.
Well, yes, sir, but there are 2 options here. The Secretary of State, as he expressed in his letter...
I don't want a narrative. Are you aware, yes or no?
Obviously, we had to have options. The Secretary of State's letter said he was either going to fire them or make another decision. If you, depending on what decision
But this
you
is
make,
a high-profile post.
I'm afraid I don't know this level
Okay,
of detail
well,
that you're going
are
at.
you willing, as the person in charge, you just said you were in charge, are you willing to report back to this committee within 30 days to make us aware, and I'm assuming from your response that you wouldn't be supportive of any high-profile posting for these two individuals. Is that correct? You would not be supportive of that?
I would not be supportive of any position in which these individuals had the same levels of responsibility.
No, that's not what I'm asking. A high-profile post overseas, that's what I'm asking. So you are supportive of it?
No, sir, I am neither one nor the other. I'm just saying, sir, that profile and responsibility are two different things.
Well, but that's a judgment call on your part. Well, let me go on a little bit further then. This report talks about bonuses, between $10,000 to $15,000 bonuses that are given to State Departments. Up until 2011, those were disclosed publicly.
Right.
It now appears that either you or Secretary Clinton have made a decision not to disclose those. Is that correct?
I am unaware of that.
So you're unaware of that. So you would be
back.
glad to support it, because it's been suggested that some of these people in the ARB got bonuses, and that now we're not disclosing it because it would look bad. You're not aware of that?
I'm also not aware that anybody in subject to the ARB got a bonus. I will confirm that, but I'm not aware that they got.
So who made the decision, you or Secretary Clinton, to not be transparent with regard to bonus information?
I am not aware. I don't think it was either of us, but I have to go back and find out. I may have done something, but that is a level of detail.
If you'll report back, I yield back.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Stockman of Texas.
Thank you. I have to say, after that brief exchange with my colleague, Mr. Meadows, my earlier colleague asked if you knew some words. And what I'm puzzled at is you earlier mentioned that you hadn't made a determination of what caused the attack, but on all the talk shows, we heard was a video, including the president. But he was asking if you knew some words, and I'm going to ask you if you know some words, yes or no. Do you know the word stonewalling? Do you know the word cover-up?
Yes, sir.
Do you know the word scandal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I'm going to yield the balance of my time to my good friend from California, Dana, because I feel that's what happened here today, and I think Mr. Meadows' line of questioning fits those three questions or definitions.
Thank you very much for yielding to me. Let me just note there are two distinct views of this whole episode in American history. We have you telling us that you believe that since that murder of our ambassador and 3 other Americans, that terrorist attack, that there's been a full court press on the part of the administration to bring those to justice and to get the word out about the American people. The opposite view is just expressed by my friend Mr. Stockman, where it seems to be is a year of obfuscation, stonewalling, denial, and cover-up. I think that it is vital for the American people to understand the truth of which of these views reflects reality. Let me ask you just a couple questions. How many government employees, including the agency and State Department, et cetera, how many federal government employees were in Benghazi the night of the attack?
Madam Chair, I respectfully cannot answer questions that involve classified information in this session.
Well, would you be, if I could interrupt the gentleman, we could do that in a classified setting as early as tomorrow, the next day?
I am prepared to appear before this committee at any time in either classified.
Okay. So let me ask you something. To your knowledge, has any of these, because we have been told there are a number of figures out there in terms of maybe up to 40 people, 45 people present, some of whom, or many of whom, had skills enough to be engaged in defending our ambassador and preventing that attack, or at least thwarting it. To your have any of those people, those who were there, of course you can't tell us how many, have any of them been asked not to cooperate with congressional or media inquiries or to take lie detector tests?
I am unaware of any State Department personnel being instructed like that, and the State Department does not utilize lie detector tests except in exceptional
I'm very happy.
circumstances.
You know, look, weasel words. I'm unaware of State Department. Did I ask State Department? I didn't. I don't think I asked about the State Department.
I'm
I asked
sorry.
if any of you have any knowledge of any of those people who are on the scene. Now, you can't tell us how many there were, but you know they were there. Have any of them been told not to cooperate with a congressional investigation? Don't hedge it with, I don't know, the State Department people. That wasn't the question.
But I am the Undersecretary of State for Management, sir, and can only answer questions about the State Department.
All right. Okay. Well, that's a good dodge as well. Let me ask you this. There's an ambassador who's been murdered. We have 3 other people who've been murdered. It's a terrorist attack. Why is it the CIA and why aren't they the ones doing this investigation? Why is it the FBI? I thought the FBI was supposed to be doing internal domestic investigations.
By statute, sir, the FBI is charged with the responsibility for the killing of any American citizen overseas. That is an FBI responsibility by statute.
Okay.
The FBI obviously works with the CIA and works with the military, but that is a congressional statute that gives the FBI that responsibility.
That gives them the sole responsibility?
The FBI is a law enforcement agency, sir.
Yeah, and this is not, and let me make it very clear, we're not talking about a crime in the United States. We're not talking about law enforcement, and this is one of the distinct differences between the administration and other people who disagree with its approach. What we're talking about here is a terrorist attack, which is not a criminal matter, which is a matter of national security, which the CIA and all the rest of our intelligence agencies should have been involved in. Instead, we give it to people who are treating it as a crime, who don't want to go into Benghazi because they haven't been given permission. This is absolutely absurd, and I think it's not. I don't think that is lost on the American people.
If I might, sir, the FBI is a member of the intelligence community. The FBI is both a national security, a law enforcement, and an intelligence agency.
And you described this as breaking of a law. They're also basic law enforcers. Terrorism and a terrorism threat to the United States is a security issue, and if the CIA and these other people are giving it over to our law enforcement, FBI, it's a mistaken decision from the top. Thank you.
Yes, we want to thank Ambassador Kennedy for his time here today. And
yes, we do.
As we've heard, the committee is deeply concerned with the lack of accountability at the State Department. Several members have outstanding questions. We've been trying for some time to get those documents directly. We know that the Department will be answering those outstanding questions in a timely fashion, but again, we reiterate, we need those answers, we need those documents here at the committee, and we thank you again, Ambassador Kennedy, for your testimony today. We thank the members as well. We stand adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Always ready, thank you, Ed.
Okay.